Now, Henry Harteveld is a travel analyst and founder of the Atmospheric Research Group. He spoke to me about the Flight 370 disappearance and its impact on the global airline industry, and I asked him what that also means for Malaysian Airlines.
I think we need to really find out what happened to the airplane first before we leap to any conclusions. If it was something unique to that airplane, that's one thing. If it's indicative of a problem with the 777 fleet, that's very, very different, and then the problems could be far more widespread than we already believe.
Airlines around the world, a lot of people talk about the training that perhaps some of these pilots have. It may be military, it may be otherwise, but in Southeast Asia in particular, some of the pilots may not have the same type of training that we see perhaps in other countries. Is there a way to perhaps mitigate that risk to ensure that all pilots have the same amount of training?
Well, if it's deemed that there's some serious flaws with the pilot training here, there are bodies such as IATA, which represents the airline industry, ICAO, which also is a worldwide group representing airlines via the UN, and others that could advocate a consistency in terms of training, hours flown, type of training received, and so on. Airlines like Malaysia, though, are very proud of their training, and they would not, frankly, have been accepted into the One World Alliance if the partners had not done due diligence and made sure that Malaysia's training was up to standard.
When we look around the world, there are a lot of airlines that have had very serious accidents. Some airlines survive, like Air France, for example. Some airlines don't. They get merged and morphed into another airline, like Pan Am and TWA. Malaysian Airlines, will they survive this 3 years from now?
That's a really good question. I actually used to work for TWA. TWA 800 did contribute to that airline's demise, but that was a function of poor financing and failure to invest in its fleet. Malaysia Airlines is 52% owned by the Malaysian government, or branch of the Malaysian government. So I think that financially the government will step in to make sure the airline survives. But the airline faces an enormous challenge in terms of restoring public confidence. I think it's going to have to look at replacing its CEO and, depending on what we determine, possibly other members of its leadership as well.
Well, Henry, you bring that up. I mean, they've been criticized, for our audience, they've been criticized for the way they've been handling this crisis that they're dealing with right now. And some folks would argue that this is going to have a very long-term impact on the airline. Others would argue perhaps in 6 months to a year from now, people will forget the crisis that they're dealing with right now.
You know, it's a fair point. I think a lot of this will depend on what do we find and when. Air France, for example, was very serious about cooperating with authorities, and they and Airbus and others worked to try to find the wreckage of Air France 447 a few years ago. It took them 2 years, but they were successful. Malaysia Airlines has to show a sincere effort that it is working to find the wreckage and work with the families left behind and show that they are committed to running a safe, reliable airline. But I don't have high hopes that the current management team are necessarily the people who can and should lead the airline. I think they should explore looking for a new CEO, and I think they need to look at possibly other new leadership as well.
I watched the press conference when they announced that the plane had, quote, ended. And there was a lot of criticism that the families of the victims were sent text messages notifying them that essentially their loved ones were dead at that point. Should that have been handled very differently?
Absolutely. As someone who's spent a career in marketing, communications are critical at a time of crisis. And having worked for airlines where we have lost aircraft, I can tell you that you want to brief families before you brief the public. Sending a text message is absolutely inexcusable. It is shameful. It is wrong. And they did the wrong thing, perhaps with noble intentions, but very poor execution. The press handling of this, the public handling of the communications by Malaysia Airlines have been abominable, and they should be ashamed.
Let me move forward with this in terms of what the airline should be doing. if this debris that they're looking at right now on the west coast of Australia does become the debris from the aircraft, how should the airline move forward and handle dealing with the families?
Well, I think they need to be very careful. This is what they need to do is first make sure they have definitive evidence of what happened, gather all the facts, and then bring the families together and hold a private briefing with them and share as much information as clearly and as fully as possible.